The torrential rain poured down on the town of Blackwood, lightning tearing through the ominous sky. No one in the town could have foreseen that this stormy night would mark the beginning of a nightmare. At St. Helena's Asylum, surrounded by its imposing stone walls, a serial killer known as the Night Stalker broke through every barrier and vanished into the darkness. He, a man with a twisted mind, was once the town's most brilliant psychologist. But one day, after his wife and daughter were brutally murdered in a case that was never solved, he began to lose control, his mind slowly descending into madness. He saw his victims as those who had to pay for the sins they had committed, those who had never been punished by the law. Tonight, he escaped the asylum, carrying with him a thirst for blood and a deep-seated hatred. Following day, the small town of Blackwood fell into a state of alarm. Sheriff Williams, a hardened man with a past filled with difficult cases, received the news from the asylum. The Night Stalker had escaped. Williams knew this wasn't just any dangerous criminal. This was personal. He had once been the Night Stalker's closest friend, before everything fell apart. As the town tried to carry on with daily life, a shadow of fear began to spread. People started bolting their windows, no one daring to step outside after sunset. But in that growing darkness, the Night Stalker silently prepared for his first hunt since escaping the asylum. Williams and his police force set up checkpoints everywhere, but nothing seemed able to stop him. He moved like a ghost, leaving no trace behind. Then, one night, under the blood-red moon, first body was found. A young man, his throat savagely slashed. Sheriff Williams couldn't shake the horrifying image of the corpse from his mind. The slashes on the victim's throat weren't just signs of death. They were a message, a grim reminder of the past Williams had tried so hard to bury. The Night Stalker wasn't just killing. He was resurrecting old wounds, drawing Williams into his sick game. As night continued to fall over Blackwood, more bodies were discovered. Each victim had some connection to Williams, either someone he had once protected or those he had investigated but never convicted. The Night Stalker was hunting prey from within Williams' own memories, as if he was reliving his own tragic past with each brutal cut. Williams knew he had to end this nightmare quickly before the entire town descended into chaos. But he also understood that he wasn't just up against a cold-blooded killer. He was confronting the ghosts of his own past. Williams began to sift through old case files, desperately searching for a connection between the victims and the Night Stalker. Fragmented clues from years past started to piece together, revealing a terrifying truth. All of the victims were linked to the unsolved murder case in which the Night Stalker's wife and daughter had been the victims. That case had been forgotten, buried deep in the town's history. But now, the Night Stalker was exacting his revenge, killing each person he believed was responsible. As Williams painstakingly connected the dots, he failed to notice that the Night Stalker was closing in. Killer wasn't just hunting others, he was targeting Williams himself. The Night Stalker, Williams was the final name on his list, the one he blamed for all the tragedies that had unfolded. As the moon rose high in the sky, Williams received an anonymous phone call. The voice on the other end was deep, cold, and unmistakable. The voice that had haunted him for years. The Night Stalker was closer than ever. He issued a chilling challenge. "We will end this tomorrow night, the place where it all began." That night, Williams drove to the abandoned house on the outskirts of town, the place where the Night Stalker's family had once lived. It was a place long forgotten, left to decay after the horrific massacre. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the forest surrounding the house, creating a scene that was both hauntingly beautiful and terrifying. As Williams approached the house, memories from the past came flooding back, memories that only served to strengthen his resolve. He knew he had to face the Night Stalker, not just to put an end to this nightmare, but to confront the guilt that had been eating away at him for years. Entering the house, Williams felt the weight of the years that had passed since the tragedy. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay, and the floorboards creaked underfoot, as if the house itself was groaning under the burden of its dark history. He moved through the dilapidated rooms, each step taking him deeper into the shadows of his own conscience. Finally, He reached the last room, the one where it had all begun. There, in the center of the room, stood the Night Stalker, waiting, a sharp blade glinting in his hand. His eyes no longer held the humanity they once did. They were the eyes of a demon, burning with an insatiable thirst for blood. The confrontation that followed was not just a battle between two men. It was a clash between past and present, between sin and redemption. The Night Stalker lunged at Williams with a fury that could only come from years of pent-up rage. The knife in his hand was a blur of silver, slicing through the air with deadly precision. But Williams was prepared. He had spent the night before steeling himself for this moment, knowing that it would take every ounce of his strength and resolve to survive. He dodged the first strike, feeling the cold rush of air as the blade narrowly missed his throat. He countered with a blow of his own, using the butt of his gun to knock the knife from the Night Stalker's hand. The fight was brutal, chaotic. Two men grappled, each trying to gain the upper hand. Night Stalker fought with the wild desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose, while Williams fought with the knowledge that this was his last chance to make things right. But as the struggle wore on, Williams began to realize that this confrontation was far more than he had anticipated. The Night Stalker seemed almost possessed, his movements unnatural, driven by a force that defied reason. Each time Williams thought he had the upper hand, the Night Stalker would twist and turn, evading his grasp with a speed and agility that was inhuman. It was then that Williams understood the true nature of the battle. This was not just a fight against a man. It was a fight against the darkness that had consumed him. Night Stalker was not simply seeking revenge. He was trying to drag Williams down into the same abyss that had claimed him. With this realization, Williams knew what he had to do. He stopped fighting with brute force and instead began to speak to the man he once knew, the friend he had lost to the shadows. He reminded the Night Stalker of the man he had been, of the love he had once had for his family, of the justice they had both sought in their work. At first, it seemed as though his words had no effect. The Night Stalker continued to fight, his eyes blazing with hatred. But then, slowly, something changed. The fury in his eyes began to waver, replaced by a flicker of doubt. Pain. Williams seized on this moment of hesitation, pressed harder, speaking with all the conviction he could muster, telling the Night Stalker that it wasn't too late to end the cycle of violence. He could still find peace. The knife slipped from the Night Stalker's hand, clattering to the floor. He fell to his knees, his body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. The demonic light in his eyes faded, leaving behind only the broken man that Williams had once called his friend. Williams stood over him, his own heart heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. He knew that this wasn't a victory. There could be no true victory in a situation like this. But it was an end of sorts to the nightmare that had haunted both of them for so long. The town of Blackwood would eventually move on, as towns do. People would rebuild, and life would return to a semblance of normalcy. But Williams would never forget that night, or the price that had been paid. He would carry the scars with him, constant reminder of the darkness that had come so close to consuming them all. And as he left the house, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees, Williams couldn't help but wonder if the shadows would ever truly leave Blackwood or if they would always linger, just out of sight, waiting for the next storm to bring them back.